Welcome to the Ready for the Draft podcast. I'm your host, Gregg Schutze. This is episode 17 of the 2023 podcast series, where we take a look at the draft eligible prospects and get you ready for the NFL draft. And as I mentioned in the last podcast, put together a 7-round mock draft, released it out on the website, readyforthedraft.com. My first mock draft 1.0, if you will. And obviously there's going to be a lot that's going to change over the next couple of months before the draft at the end of April. We've got the combine that we're going to be having coming up here on February 28th through March 6th. Then you're going to have the individual workouts. Keep in mind you're also going to have free agency. You know there are going to be some cap casualties, some guys that are going to be released, which will shift some of those draft priorities, especially if you're bringing in some free agents as well. Take care of some of the needs, be able to focus the draft and that whole mindset in a different direction. So even though this is mock draft 1.0, I'm sure we'll have several iterations before we get to the final mock draft, just a couple of days before the draft begins at the end of April. So what I'd like to do is kind of walk through my first round, just kind of talk through each of the picks as of right now, and really kind of start getting that framework together as we start moving through this draft. Really be able to start talking through the positions, especially the next podcast. We're going to really break down the combine, what to expect, who to look out for, and really kind of break things down there. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the mock draft. So the first pick, obviously, we know are the Chicago Bears. They've been really on the clock since the end of the season. And when you look at the Bears, they're in an interesting situation, right? They're sitting there at number 1 overall. Justin Fields is their quarterback. The first question that they have to ask is Justin Fields going to be the answer? Are they going to look to trade Justin Fields? There's a lot of rumors, speculation that maybe that will happen, to trade him to a quarterback needy team, get a stockpile of picks, because look, whoever's under center at quarterback is going to need help, both at the receiver position and on the front line. Really, you're also talking about potentially in that backfield as well. Lots of needs up front, and then also on the defensive side, that front seven really needs to get shored up as well. So a lot of needs. You could trade Justin Fields, get the quarterback Bryce Young there at number 1 overall, or you keep Justin Fields. And really, that's the decision Ryan Poles is going to have to make. He and Matt Eberflus, the head coach. Is Justin Fields going to be your guy? I don't think there's really been enough to say that yes, they should move on from Justin Fields. I think there's been some promise there. Really, he hasn't had the weapons around him, hasn't had an offensive line that's been consistent, really kind of a revolving door, and been under pressure all the time. So I really think that Chicago ends up keeping Justin Fields, and that number 1 pick is likely going to be traded to the highest bidder. A team that's really in search of a quarterback right now. I think the Indianapolis Colts are the obvious team sitting there at number 4, try to get ahead of Houston and try to get Bryce Young, potentially the Raiders, depending on what happens there at the quarterback position. We already know that Derek Carr is on his way out. So what does that look like for the Raiders? The Panthers sitting there at number 9. Sam Darnold looked much better towards the end of the season. He's not going to be a long-term answer, though. He'd be a nice stopgap as a guy who could really help develop a quarterback. And then obviously there's Seattle. What do they do at number 5? Are they going to go quarterback? Really, if Geno Smith does sign that extension, then obviously they're going to be off the table there as well. So lots to consider. Ultimately, if the Bears stay there at number 1, I think this pick will end up being Will Anderson Jr., the outside linebacker from Alabama. And look, both he and Jalen Carter are really 1 and 2, or possibly even 1 and 1A in terms of their play out on the field. But Anderson is the most dynamic player in this year's draft. Let's not get it twisted there. 6'4", 235 pounds, had an insane 2021 season. 101 tackles, 31 tackles for loss, 17.5 sacks. This year teams were really keeping an eye on number 31. Where was he? He was being asked to put his hand in the dirt, really being asked to do a lot of different things, was frustrated at the beginning of the season, still ended up with 51 tackles, 17 going for loss, 10 sacks on the year. so explosive, a guy that's going to come off the edge and really pressure you, really a nice pass rush repertoire as well. When you look at the Bears and that defense, Travis Gibson, Al-Qadim Muhammad, Terrell Lewis, we're getting after the quarterback, and then you look at the linebackers, Nicholas Morrow, Joe Thomas, Matthew Adams, a lot of free agents there at the linebacker position, really. So they don't have a guy that they can really hang their hat on to be a pass rusher. So I really think that this is a match made in heaven, if you will. Would Jalen Carter fit in here? They've got Justin Jones, Armon Watts, Jalen Holmes, Mike Pennell. Again, free agents up front. So Jalen Carter could also fit in here, and I think depending on where they trade, if they trade beyond the Arizona there at number 3, they end up trading with the Indianapolis at number 4, then Will Anderson's likely going to go to the Cardinals, which would then mean Jalen Carter is going to be their guy. If they stay at 1, Will Anderson should be the pick. That makes the most sense, really, because he is the most dynamic player in this year's draft. But when you look at the top 4, Will Anderson, Bryce Young, Jalen Carter, C.J. Stroud, in some order, that should be what you expect. The top 2 defensive players on the board, top 2 quarterbacks. Houston sitting there at number 2. I saw some speculation that maybe Houston wouldn't go quarterback. Maybe they're satisfied with Davis Mills. Really, when you get the new head coach in there, the new regime, D'Amico Ryans there, he doesn't have an offensive coordinator just yet. So I think who he brings in will say a lot about what they want to do at that quarterback spot. Davis Mills under center hasn't played that poorly. He's been okay. But is he really truly a franchise quarterback? That's going to be the real question there for D'Amico Ryans. Does he decide to either take Will Anderson if the Bears trade out of that number 1 spot? He could even go Jalen Carter, up front as well. Get that guy who can really play all the positions up front. So defensively, there are needs there, and it does make a lot of sense. But I still think at the end of the day, that quarterback position is the most important. You've got Bryce Young. You bring him in, the Heisman Trophy winner. Look, everyone's going to talk about his lack of overall size. 6 foot, 194 pounds. But, man, I mean, he was first in the Heisman voting in 2021, then 6th again in 2022. A kid, 66% completion percentage, over 8,300 yards. 80 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. This is a kid who, he's not not a guy who's going to take off and run, but a guy who is so good at extending plays by manipulating the pocket. Very intelligent, cool, calm under pressure. A guy who throws his receivers open, the anticipation, the ball placement, and he's got an arm to be able to make all the throws you're going to need him to at the next level. If there's a guy that you could insert into an offense and have him start right away, out of this draft class, it's going to be Bryce Young. So I think Houston, it'd behoove them to get their quarterback of the future in there, get a high character guy like Bryce Young and really let him take this franchise forward. I think, D'Amico, that new regime, they need that quarterback, and I think Bryce Young makes a lot of sense. Number 3, the Arizona Cardinals. So the Arizona Cardinals are sitting here, and I think really they have to be excited with their draft position. Obviously, number 3 overall, that's not something that's going to be, you would tend to get excited about. But when you look at what's happening with their defense, right? Their edge rushers, they have, Myjai Sanders, Marcus Golden, Cameron Thomas. Hopefully we'll get a larger role coming off the edge, but they don't have that dynamic playmaker. Marcus Golden was at his best when he had Chandler Jones opposite him. Chandler Jones now with the Raiders, they could use Will Anderson coming off the edge, putting pressure on the quarterback. You look up front, you've got Zach Allen, who's going to be a free agent. He may not be back. I think a lot of teams are going to be interested in his services. At nose tackle, you've got Leki Fotu. Defensive tackle, Rashard Lawrence, Michael Dogba, and Tristan Hill, also free agents. They're lacking playmakers up front. So Jalen Carter would make a ton of sense there as well. He could take over for Zach Allen. He'd be an upgrade over Rashard Lawrence and really Leki Fotu at the nose as well. So depending on which direction you want to go, I think Jalen Carter would make a lot of sense there as well. If Will Anderson is off the board, like I said, Jalen Carter will be the answer, and that's how I have my mock draft shaping up right now. Jalen Carter there, number 3 overall to the Arizona Cardinals. Number 4, the Indianapolis Colts. And Chris Ballard, I think really this franchise has not been able to figure out the quarterback position since Andrew Luck retired. You had Carson Wentz, and then there was the experiment with a lot of the veteran quarterbacks, really that stopgap from Phillip Rivers to Matt Ryan. None of those guys were going to be a long-term answer at that quarterback position. They don't have a head coach in place yet, and that could tell you which direction they want to go at that quarterback spot. Will Levis, I hear a lot of people floating his name out there, the quarterback from Kentucky. He's a big, strong-arm kid. I think a lot of people are looking for the next Josh Allen. I think there are some physical traits that you have to get excited about with Will Levis, but I think it's going to take some time for him to develop. Matt Ryan's going to be under contract, so you could draft Will Levis, let him sit behind Matt Ryan. But when you look at C.J. Stroud and you look at what he's been able to do there for the Buckeyes, he doesn't have that prototypical arm strength. But look, people said the same thing about Joe Burrow when he was coming out of LSU. Didn't have the arm strength. It's just an average arm. You heard it from a lot of the draft experts, a lot of people, especially on the draft Twitterverse, if you will. And all Joe Burrow has done is lead the Bengals to a Super Bowl and an AFC championship in the last 2 seasons. And C.J. Stroud, in terms of his mental makeup, this is a guy who does a great job. Just like Bryce Young, always stays cool under pressure. A guy who understands the offense very well there at Ohio State, and puts the ball right on the money for his receivers, throws his receivers open, allows him to make a play after the catch, and when he needs to, he can put some zip on the football. Even though you watch him, a lot of the throws where he needs to put the ball on a line, he'll struggle driving those footballs really on the short to intermediate routes. Some of the deeper routes where he's asked to put some touch on the football, you really see that. But he's all about anticipation, ball placement. 6'3", 215. Look, he was a Heisman finalist, 4th in 2021, 3rd in 2022, over 8,000 yards, 69.3% completion percentage, 85 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. To me, he seems like the guy, a little bit more polished to him, would be the guy that Chris Ballard would go for. Will Levis, on the other hand, 6'3", 222 pounds, a lot to like I said. 65% completion percentage, just over 5,800 yards, 46 touchdowns, 25 interceptions. Now look, the thing with him, he's had a poor offensive line, not the best receiving core, couple of knocks there to the offense that he was really running. And you heard a lot of that same narrative there with Josh Allen when he was at Wyoming. And when you were trying to project him, 6'5", 233 pounds, only 56% completion percentage, over 5,000 yards, 44 touchdowns, 21 interceptions. You look at that, and Will Levis, the physicality is there. A guy who plays the quarterback position like a linebacker, so you worry about some of those injuries and things like that. But decision making, is something that Will Levis struggles with. I think those are some of the things that Josh Allen was able to clean up, especially in his final year there with the Cowboys, and that's something that I don't think we've necessarily seen with Will Levis. So I think he left some throws out there on the field. I think some of that completion percentage was padded a little bit with a lot of the shorter throws. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think Indy goes C.J. Stroud, and especially Bryce Young's off the board. I think it's going to be a much tougher decision if both of them are there, but I think ultimately Bryce Young would be the guy at number 1 if Indy were to trade with the Bears. But as it stands right now, because I don't factor in any possible trades into my mock drafts, I've got C.J. Stroud, number 4 overall to the Colts. Now, number 5, thanks to the Denver Broncos in the trade for Russell Wilson, Seattle Seahawks have 2 first-round picks sitting there in the top 5 after their playoff run. And look, Seattle, they could go in a few different directions, right? I think ultimately they have to look at the defensive line. That's really the main thing I think that they really need to make sure their focus is this offseason. Poona Ford, defensive tackle. He's been a nice addition there up front. A guy who was I believe he was an undrafted free agent out of Texas, and really has played well for them. He may be on his way out. You've got Shelby Harris, Al Woods, but not really a whole lot of depth. LJ Collier's also a free agent, so he may be on the way out. I think you look at a guy like Jalen Carter, if he were to fall to number 5, if there is a lot of shuffling going on above Seattle, then Jalen Carter makes a ton of sense, and I think Seattle could potentially look to trade up to get that physical presence in the middle of that defense. With him off the board, you look at a guy like Tyree Wilson, and I think he fits a little bit more than someone like Myles Murphy at that defensive end position. I think if you're taking Myles Murphy, chances are he's 6'4", 275. He'd be a little undersized for that defensive end in that 34 defense. You look at Bruce Irvin. He's going to be a free agent, but you have Darrell Taylor. You drafted Boye Mafe, Alton Robinson, Uchenna Nwosu. But what you're really lacking is that presence there coming off the edge, and I think that Tyree Wilson out of Texas Tech is the guy that makes the most sense. This is a guy who is a tremendous athlete, but he also has that length that he uses to his advantage. 6'6", 275, and has the frame to be able to put on some weight and still be able to be effective coming off the edge. He's not a guy that you're going to see bend a ton, but he gives you constant effort. You love the repertoire, not always just going for a long arm. I think of Isaiah Foskey, he loves to long arm you to death, and you don't see that counter move or a secondary move. Tyree Wilson is going to use that length. He's going to fake inside, go outside, fake outside, go inside. 14 tackles for loss, 7 sacks, 2 straight years with 7 sacks on the season. I think that, and that's just this past year was just through 10 games. So I think Tyree Wilson is going to be the number 1 defensive end, true defensive end coming off the board, and Seattle, that'll be a nice addition to their front. The next pick at number 6, Detroit. Hey, this was the Matthew Stafford trade, able to get the number 6 overall pick from the Rams. And the Lions, this is another team that I think can go in a lot of different directions. I think a lot of people in their mock drafts have Brian Bresee coming off the board here. I think Brian Bresee is a guy that struggled with injuries, inconsistency, the family, the tragedy as well. That all takes its toll. And when you look at the Lions, they've picked up Aleem McNeil, Levi Omuzurike, up front. Michael Brockers is still on the roster. Maybe that's not the direction that they actually go. Maybe they end up putting in Brian Bresee there at the defensive end spot with John Kaminsky as a free agent, but Josh Paschal's played well in that role. So it'll be interesting to see exactly if they do decide to go defensive tackle, where they go. I think they ultimately do, but I think they wait until round number 2 to do that. When you look at the Lions, Jamal Williams is a free agent. DeAndre Swift kind of up and down career there with the Lions. So Bijan Robinson is number 5 number 6 a little too high. Probably so. So when you look at it, you've got that cornerback spot, Jeff Okudah. They picked him up in the first round a couple of years ago. He's been streaky at best. I don't think he's lived up to that billing. You've got Jerry Jacobs at the other starting corner spot. You've got Amani Oruwariye and Mike Hughes, who are free agents, as is the nickelback Will Harris. I think ultimately they go after the cornerback position, and there are 3 guys at corner that are going to come off the board in probably the top 20 picks, and that's Christian Gonzalez of Oregon, Penn State's Joey Porter, and my guy who I think is ultimately going to end up being the pick here, and that's Devon Witherspoon. And with Devon Witherspoon, look, he's 6 foot, 170 pounds, a guy who has 25 pass breakups in his career, had 3 interceptions as well this past season. But this is a dude who is also very physical. He's going to come up and hit you, and everyone remembers the hit that went viral against Indiana. This is a guy who has 11.5 tackles for loss. He's not afraid to come downhill and make his presence known in the run game. He's going to be very physical on the outside, and he's a pretty darn good lockdown corner. You see the ability to close in a hurry. The ball skills are evident, and so you put him opposite Jeff Okudah. I think that's really starting to build that back end of the defense there for Aaron Glenn. Number 7 overall, the Las Vegas Raiders, and this is a team, again, could go quarterback. There is some interest there potentially, but when you look at it, Derek Carr, we already know is on his way out, and it sounds like NFL.com, ESPN, Bleacher Report, a lot of different outlets are reporting that there's a framework in place for a deal with the Saints. Saints obviously need a quarterback. They've got Andy Dalton, Jameis Winston. What's going to happen there? But when I look at the Raiders, you brought in Devontae Adams. He's not going to want to go through a rebuilding process. You've got Jarrett Stidham there at the quarterback spot. You bring in a rookie into that quarterback position. I just, you bring in Devontae Adams because you're thinking that you can take that next step in the AFC West. I think the best way to do that is to get a quarterback in there, an established veteran. There's been talk that maybe Aaron Rodgers would reunite with Devontae Adams. They could look for other quarterbacks to bring in as well. I just don't see them going after a quarterback, at least in this year's draft. What I do see, though, is the Raiders going after an offensive tackle. They've got Colton Miller there on the left side. Jermaine Illuminor is a free agent. Thayer Munford is really a backup tackle. He's not, backup guard, I should say, not really a tackle. I think at the end of the day, you're going after the number one tackle. Number one tackle in my eyes is Peter Skoronski. Everyone's going to talk about the lack of overall length, but look, I think Rashawn Slater's been able to prove them wrong. This guy's a technician. He's not quite the athlete that Rashawn Slater was, but look, Northwestern grads, they know how to play the position. You watch the bend, you watch the hand placement, you watch his ability to anchor, his movement skills, the lateral agility, his ability to wall guys off in the running game, his ability to climb to the second level. He can be physical when you need to. I think he's the most complete offensive tackle, and I think the Raiders, it would behoove them to bring him in. And ultimately, if they decide they want to move Skoronski to guard a la Brandon Sheriff, there is some ability to do that on this roster, especially considering Alex Bars, who started at right guard. He's a free agent as well. So if you did decide that Peter Skoronski, you can immediately get some production out of him at the guard position, you could do that with the ultimate decision to get him outside to that tackle spot. To me, I think he's a left tackle all the way. You could potentially move Colton Miller to the opposite side, but I think he'd be just as good on the right side. Raiders need to be able to protect whoever their quarterback's going to be, and Skoronski would be the guy for me. Atlanta, sitting there at number 8. Now, I didn't mention Atlanta for the quarterback spot, and this is an organization, again, the question that Arthur Smith is going to have to ask is Desmond Ridder going to be the guy? They brought him in. He did some good things for them, but ultimately, do they see him as the long-term answer there at the quarterback position? I guess that's really what we're going to find out. They could decide to, you already have one a second-year quarterback, so then you're going to bring in a rookie quarterback. It's possible that could happen, but I'm just looking at this defensive line, and this is a team that, again, struggled to put pressure on the quarterback. I think that seems to be a theme that we're talking about each and every year with the Atlanta Falcons. Now they brought in Ryan Nielsen, a guy that I went to school with at USC. He was the co-defensive coordinator with Chris Richard, another former Trojan. And what Ryan Nielsen is known for is developing defensive linemen. When you watch what he did there at NC State, there are a lot of players that got drafted that he coached up there with the Wolfpack. And I think that's really what helped kind of springboard him into the NFL and now he's that defensive coordinator. So when you look at it, he's looking for someone who can be explosive coming off the edge, and I'm looking at Myles Murphy, and it makes a ton of sense to me. When you look at what Murphy's been able to do for Clemson, he's an athletic freak. We know that he's going to test very well at the combine. He's one of the guys that I'm really looking forward to seeing run and go through all the different drills. 6'5", 275, 36 tackles for loss, 18.5 sacks. I think that's the pick for Atlanta there at number 8. I mentioned the Carolina Panthers at number 9, and look, Sam Darnold played well. He's not a long-term answer, as we said. So I think this is going to be the year that Carolina is serious about going after a quarterback. Frank Reich, he's the quarterback whisperer. He's a guy that can develop quarterbacks. Darnold is a free agent, so I still think they bring him back. You do have P.J. Walker, Matt Corral on the roster, but those are guys that you're going to bring in another quarterback to compete with them. And when I'm looking at this Carolina team, I think this may be a spot for Will Levis. And really, if the Colts decide to go Levis, then this is where C.J. Stroud would fall. And I think Frank Reich would do a great job developing either of those quarterbacks. He'd have the big, strong-arm quarterback in Levis, or a more cerebral quarterback, a guy who does a really good job reading defenses, understanding his offense, and knowing where to go with the football at all times in C.J. Stroud. So with the way that the mock draft shakes out, I've got Will Levis going to Carolina there at number 9, at least as of right now. Philly, hey, they're sitting there at number 10 overall. They're another team with 2 picks in round number 1. So Philly at number 10. And we can thank the Saints for trading up to get Chris Olave to allow Philly, who, look, as of this taping, Super Bowl hasn't actually been played yet. We're actually putting this together the morning of February 11th, so you could potentially have the Super Bowl champs with a pick in the top 10. When you look at Philly, I think this is really going to be dependent upon what happens in free agency. There are some key needs that I think need to be addressed. One of those is going to be the defensive end position. You've got Brandon Graham, you've got Josh Sweat, Robert Quinn. There are going to be guys that are going to be free agents up front. Fletcher Cox, Javon Hargrave at defensive tackle as well. So Brian Bresee potentially could come off the board here at number 10. If you look at the defensive ends, Myles Murphy, if he falls, could end up being the pick here at 10. Here's another thought. Bijan Robinson. You've got Miles Sanders, who's a free agent. Kenneth Gainwell's played well. You look at what Jalen Hurts is able to do at the quarterback spot, but if you have a dynamic running back like Bijan Robinson, the rich get richer. A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, Jalen Hurts, Bijan Robinson. Good Lord. You'd want to talk about some firepower there on that group. That's really something to watch out for there at number 10. They could wait until the end of round 1, potentially go after a guy like, Jahmyr Gibbs, and they could even wait and on day 2 get a running back there as well that could compete there with Miles Sanders. With Kenneth Gainwell, because Miles Sanders will be a free agent. They could ultimately re-sign Miles Sanders, and we're not having this conversation about the running back spot. We really don't know what that status is going to be until we get into the whole free agency discussion. But the other guy that you have on the list there is James Bradbury. James Bradbury is going to be a free agent. I don't expect him to be back. You've got Darius Slay on one side. You're going to need a long-term answer at that cornerback position, and I think this is ultimately where Christian Gonzalez out of Oregon is going to go. If you're looking for a pure cover corner that you can put out on an island, a guy who is sticky in man, can close in a hurry in zone, a guy who has tremendous ball skills, and then the length at 6'2", 200, Christian Gonzalez is going to be your guy. 4 interceptions this past year, just 7 pass breakups, but a guy, look, teams did not want to throw in his direction there with the Oregon Ducks. I think that would be a great addition there for Philly, really shoring up the back end of that defense. Tennessee sitting there at number 11, and look, the Titans, disappointing season for sure. The question really is going to be, what do they do with that offensive line? They have Nicolas Petit-Frere there at right tackle. Dennis Daly and LaRaven Clark are the backups, and they are both free agents. But then you look at Taylor Lewan and Taylor Lewan's health. I think that's really the biggest concern is the long-term health of Taylor Lewan. A guy that that body is starting to break down. It seems like just about every year we're talking about him having to sit out some games here and there. He is just 31 years of age, but that's one of those things too, to where how healthy is he going to be? Can we keep him out there on the field? I think those are going to be definite questions that the Tennessee Titans are going to have to ask. Obviously you've got Ryan Tannehill there at the quarterback position. Is he going to be still your long-term answer there? Nose tackle, they have Tier Tart. They could potentially decide to move on from him. So is there a chance that they could trade up for Jalen Carter? Not likely, but it's something to still keep an eye on. Be mindful of, if nothing else. They've done a lot of work with the secondary, so I don't know that that's really a direction that they would look. They've already addressed a receiver in the first round. I don't think that's where they're going to look either. Really, I think it's going to be at the end of the day, trying to think of where else would they go with this pick other than an eventual successor to Taylor Lewan, and I can't find one. I think ultimately at the end of the day, that's the direction that they look. And when you talk about Taylor Lewan, his contract, he won't be a free agent until 2024. So ultimately, he will be in the last year of his contract. $14.8 million that is going to be owed to him, and so that's really what you're looking at there. There's no dead cap or anything like that with the salary, but I don't see them looking to get rid of Taylor Lewan necessarily. I think if they did release him, then you're definitely looking at the Titans taking an offensive lineman. But here's what I'm thinking: you bring in Paris Johnson out of Ohio State. A guy who, he started his career at Ohio State playing out of position at guard. Nate Davis is a free agent there at right guard. You bring him in, you allow him to start right away at the guard spot, and then Taylor Lewan is a free agent. He hits free agency. You probably aren't re-signing him, and then you can move Paris Johnson over to that left tackle position. And really, you've got bookend Ohio State Buckeyes there for Ryan Tannehill. So I think that's ultimately the move that ends up happening. You go with Paris Johnson, the number 2 tackle in the draft. Houston sitting there at number 12. We've talked through some of the scenarios there for Houston. And look, with DeMeco Ryans on the roster, in charge now, sitting here at 12, who's a guy that they could potentially go after here? If he likes one of the defensive ends, because there are a lot of guys, Lucas Van Ness to Keon White, Will McDonald, Derek Hall. I think that you're not going to be taking them at number 12. None of those guys are going to warrant that. You're going to see a few of those names in round number 1. The rest of them are going to roll to day 2. So I really don't think that that's going to be an option for you. When you're sitting there at 12, maybe there's a quarterback that's still sitting out there that someone wants to trade up for. Thinking about Anthony Richardson, so there's a good chance that we could potentially see a team do that, and then they can move down and maybe be in a position to take one of those edge rushers. They need some help there at that linebacker position as well. So those are really the areas they're looking to go defense, but I think they need to get weapons for Bryce Young there at the quarterback position. Their starting tight end Jordan Akins is a free agent. Tegan Catoriano, Brevin Jordan, they're going to be nice guys to have there on the roster, but they're number 2 and number 3 tight ends. They're not going to be a number 1. I think ultimately Michael Mayer would be a nice fit, but you also have this receiver position. Brandon Cooks, 29 years of age. He'll be a free agent after the 2024 season. At one point, his name was being mentioned as a possible trade piece there out of Houston. But ultimately, he's still on the roster. You've got Nico Collins, the bigger receiver as well, and not a whole lot of depth after that. Amari Rogers is on the roster. John Mechie is still working his way back from leukemia. So you need to add some additional weapons for Bryce Young And ultimately, the number one receiver in this draft class is Jordan Addison. And what's funny is people talk about Jordan Addison and they talk about the lack of explosiveness. And man, this guy just isn't, he's a good route runner, but he's not that explosive. But the 6 foot, 175-pound receiver there for the Trojans, in 11 games, you look at the stats, 59 catches, 875 yards, and 8 touchdowns. What you forget about, though, if you watch him against Stanford, his ability to make those cuts down the field, without losing any momentum, without losing any speed, the cuts, the ability to separate, the suddenness, and then his ability to take the top off the defense with that speed on top of that really spoke a lot. And yes, he is kind of that undersized guy, a little, you talk about that 175-pound frame. What he also has is a lot of length, and he uses that length to his advantage. Not quite to the degree of Devontae Smith, but still has a lot of length. People forget that he was the Blitnikoff Award winner in 2021, catching passes from Kenny Pickett, 100 catches, just under 1,600 yards and 17 touchdowns. Kenny Pickett is lobbying to get him there in Pittsburgh as his number one weapon. He'd love to have him there, and I think Bryce Young would also love to have Jordan Addison there. You figure Jordan Addison, you also have Brandon Cooks, Nico Collins, and then this is a good tight end draft. In round 2, round 3, potentially get a guy like Luke Musgrave in round 2, Sam Laporta in round 3, and be in really good shape to getting a couple of weapons there for that passing attack. Number 13, the New York Jets. Some people think that might be the destination for Aaron Rodgers when it's all said and done. The Jets still have to figure out that offensive line position. That's really the biggest question mark right now, right? When you look at it, Mekhi Becton has struggled to stay healthy. Dwayne Brown is getting a little long in the tooth. You've got George Fant there on the right side, Mike Remmers. They're both free agents. Dwayne Brown is not going to be the long-term answer. Max Mitchell right now is your starting right tackle. I think ultimately they need to go with another offensive tackle. I think they just have to. This is a team, they've got Laken Tomlinson, they've got Elijah Vera Tucker at the guard spots. They're set there. But Mekhi Becton, the long-term health really has to be a concern, a guy that just they can't keep on the field. And you need to have that insurance policy. And a guy, look, even if Becton is good to go, you need somebody who could potentially be an upgrade over Mitchell. I think Mitchell's really more of your swing tackle more than anything else. So I look at this group. Broderick Jones out of Georgia, the easy mover. We've talked about him in the podcast all season long. A guy that moves really well in pass pro. Doesn't generate as much movement in the running game as you'd like to see, but this is a guy that can absolutely protect the blind side of whoever's going to be under center there for the New York Jets. We know it's not going to be Zach Wilson, so who is it going to be? Will it be Mike White? Will the Jets potentially make a play for a veteran quarterback? They may not go with a rookie quarterback, at least not right now, especially considering the Zach Wilson experience is still fresh in everybody's mind. So I think Broderick Jones is the pick there at number 13. The Patriots sitting there at 14, and obviously you never know what's going to happen with Bill Belichick. We were thinking a bunch of different directions in round number 1 a season ago, and ultimately it was Cole Strange, the guard out of Chattanooga. Ended up being a nice fit there for Bill Belichick. It was just kind of a weird pick in round 1. I think we were expecting it potentially sometime on day 2 if it was going to happen. When you look at this team, what do they need? The question mark there, who's going to be the quarterback, Mac Jones, or is it going to be Bailey Zappi? They need receivers. They need receiver help, without question. You've got Devontae Parker on the roster, Nelson Aguilar, Jacoby Myers, Matthew Slater are all going to be free agents. You look at Tyquan Thornton on the roster, Kendrick Bourne. These aren't guys who are going to move the needle. They need to get a guy in there who could be a bona fide number 1 wideout. And I know that the sting from N'Keal Harry being that first round bust, they wouldn't necessarily want to go after a guy like Quentin Johnston there for TCU. But look, this is a guy who he reminds me of Drake London to some degree, with the fact that this is a guy who can play quicker than his size, has actually better speed than Drake London has, and but a guy who can be physical at the point of attack, a guy who's going to win those 50-50 balls, a guy who's going to be a matchup nightmare for teams. And look, when he was the focal point of that offense, teams weren't able to shut him down. 6'4", 193 pounds, 60 catches, over 1,000 yards, and 6 touchdowns. The guy looked 19 yards per reception, so we know that he can be a vertical threat. There are some limitations potentially to that route tree. Can he sink his hips and really drive out of those routes, or is he really just more of a linear player, a guy that's just going to run those go routes and be able to, and posts? Can he run other routes than just that? That's going to be a big question mark. We'll have to see, watch him at the combine as well, see what he looks like in those drills, just how stiff is he going to be at 6'4", but we know he's going to go in there, probably run in the 4.4s, turn some heads, and I think because of his size-speed ratio, it may be enough there for Bill Belichick to get excited enough to bring him in there at the number 14 overall pick. I wouldn't rule out Jackson Smith and Jigba there for Ohio State. He's a guy that I have coming off the board in a few picks, but Quentin Johnson just looks the part, so it'll be interesting to see what Bill Belichick does there. Green Bay at number 15. It sounds like Aaron Rodgers likely is not going to be back, which means it's going to be Jordan Love. And every year we talk about them needing receivers. And, you've got Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Randall Cobb and Alan Lazard are both free agents. So could you bring in another young receiver? You could. But when you look at that tight end spot, you've got Robert Tonyan and Mercedes Lewis are free agents. So Josiah DeGuara is really your only tight end on the roster. Tyler Davis as well. But, who's going to be catching passes at the tight end position? I look at it, I think this is really where Michael Mayer, you can pull the trigger, get another weapon there for Jordan Love. You could go defensive end, especially considering Dean Lowry and Jaron Reed are free agents. Might be a little too early to think Lucas Van Ness. Brian Bresee, though, could potentially be an option. You do have Devontae Wyatt on the roster. Are you going to go with another end? Back-to-back years with that first round. We know that Green Bay loves to go defense in the first round, but if you get a chance to get a playmaker like Michael Mayer, this is a guy, he's physical as a blocker. He's 6'4", 249, a guy that can get down the field, can create some separation with his route running. Back-to-back seasons over 800 yards receiving and 16 touchdowns during that time. Also 138 receptions. He was really the go-to guy for the Fighting Irish. To me, it's a match made in heaven, a guy that's going to be able to block for Aaron Jones and then be a favorite target for Jordan Love in the passing game. Washington sitting there at number 16. Sam Howell at the end of the season, they brought him in, and it sounds like they're going to give him a shot. I think they need to bring in a veteran quarterback. Taylor Heineke is a free agent. Carson Wentz, we already know that really didn't work out. So what's going to happen here with Washington? Darren Payne is going to be a free agent, and he may not be back. You look at the linebacker position. I think it's a little too early to go linebacker just yet. But Cole Holcomb, John Bostic, they're free agents, as is David Mayo. So you're going to have to think about that position. But ultimately, when I look at Washington, you look at that cornerback position: Kendall Fuller, Benjamin St. Just, Bobby McCain. They need a playmaker on the back end of that defense, someone to pair there with Kendall Fuller. I'm looking at Joey Porter Jr., a guy that's going to give you a ton of length. It seems like when they brought in Benjamin St. Just, that was kind of what they were looking for. I think Joey Porter Jr., he's very sticky for a guy who has tremendous length at 6'2". He's got the long arms as well. Really want to see how he tests, and really want to see what that wingspan ends up showing up, because it sounds like this guy's got some ridiculous arms in terms of that wingspan. So Joey Porter Jr., to me, seems like a lock there for Washington there at number 16. 17, the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think this pick could go in a few directions. This is another team that's going to need to address the line up front. I think they'll probably go early day 2. When you think about Larry Ogunjobi, Chris Wormley, Tyson Alualu, all are going to be free agents. So you have to think about potentially addressing the line up front. Again, maybe a little too early for Lucas Van Ness. Then you look about that offensive line. Dan Moore, the left tackle, struggled mightily. Kevin Dotson, the left guard, also struggled. I don't know that the right tackle, Chukwuma Okorafor, is going to be the answer. Really the only guys that I think are safe in terms of their positions, James Daniels, the right guard, Mason Cole at center. So you could go Anton Harrison out of Oklahoma, a big, easy mover, 6'7", 310, to battle with Dan Moore at left tackle. Or when you're looking at Kevin Dotson, you may want to go with an upgrade. I'm actually thinking Osiris Torrance may actually be a nice fit here for Pittsburgh. This is going to be a big, physical, nasty dude. He's very strong at the point of attack. I think that's one of the things that you saw at the Senior Bowl as well. This is a dude, once he locks onto you, he's not letting go. 6'5", 346 pounds, moves very well for a guy his size as well. I think he'd be a great addition there to that line because, look, you're going to have to do a better job protecting Kenny Pickett there at the quarterback position. 18, the Lions. We've mentioned Bijan Robinson previously. I'm looking at the Lions, and if Bijan's still on the board, I think you have to make a play for him. You look at, Jamal Williams is going to be gone, and more than likely, you might try to bring him in, and if they do re-sign him, then this is probably a pick that's going to be off the table. But when you have DeAndre Swift, who has been up and down, you look at the passing attack right now with Jared Goff. I think that Jared Goff gets another year with this team. I don't think that the Lions are going to use a first rounder on a quarterback. I say that they could very well turn around and go after a quarterback, but I think this is a team. Look, this is a playoff team. They really played well down the stretch. Jared Goff, one of those players who really stepped up and played well. You look at the receiving core. Jameson Williams is going to be healthy. Amon-Ra St. Brown is on the roster there. Josh Reynolds, DJ Chark's a free agent, but maybe you bring him back. That tight end position. No more TJ Hawkinson. You got Brock Wright really as your starting tight end. So if Michael Mayer's there, he might be the answer. But again, Jamal Williams, you take him out of that equation. You've got DeAndre Swift there. You bring in Bijan Robinson. It's going to take some of that pressure off Jared Goff. Give him another weapon in the passing game. Imagine an offense with Jameson Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Bijan Robinson. I mean, those are some, three very exciting young players for Jared Goff to get the football to. So just thinking through it, Bijan may not be a bad pick there for Detroit. Give you that running game and a guy that can really pound the football. You get a lead, you're going to need to sit there and grind some games out, and I think Bijan would be a guy that'd be able to do that for him. Now, Tampa Bay sitting there at number 19. Tampa Bay is going to have to figure out exactly what they're going to do with Levante David. Is Levante David going to be back? Can they re-sign him? I think they will. If they don't, then this pick could very well end up being, Drew Sanders there out of Arkansas. But I just look at this defensive end position and really just the line in general. William Golston, Patrick O'Connor, Akeem Hicks, Raheem Nunez-Roches, Tidrin Sanat, they're all free agents. And yes, I know that you brought in Logan Hall. You drafted him a season ago. You've got Vita Vea up front, but you're going to need to get some depth. You're going to need to get some guys up front. Depending on what happens in free agency, this could be Lucas Van Ness. You get a defensive end in there, a guy that's going to be able to play in that 34 defense. I think that can make a lot of sense for them. I think they need an upgrade over Donovan Smith. So Anton Harrison could be the guy there at the left tackle spot. Then you look at the corners. Jamel Dean, Sean Murphy-Bunting, even Logan Ryan, who could play corner in a pinch. He's a safety there for them, but he could also play that cornerback spot. All those guys are free agents. So when you look at this group, you're going to also need a corner. So I think if any of those top corners are available, that could be the pick there. I think watch out for Emmanuel Forbes as a potential option. Cam Smith though, out of South Carolina. I've got him coming off the board a few picks later. I ultimately think we end up switching Baltimore's pick and Tampa Bay's pick. And Lucas Van Ness may be a better fit for Baltimore. They might need some additional help there up front. Cam Smith may be better for Tampa. But really, you have to see how free agency is going to play out for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to really understand what's going to happen on that defense. So I think they either go defensive end or corner. Mock Draft 1.0 has Lucas Van Ness. It could very well end up being a corner when it's all said and done. Seattle at number 20, their second pick in round number 1. I've got them taking Bryan Bresee. I've already mentioned that they need some help up front. If they don't get Jalen Carter, they can get the number 2 defensive tackle in Bryan Bresee. I think Bryan ends up falling a little bit. He does show some stiffness at times. When you watch his film, when he wins, he seems to win the exact same way every time. It's like you're watching, it's deja vu every single time. And it's one of those things to where, there is some stiffness to his game. You see, some physicality at the point of attack. You see some quickness off the football. But, he's not a guy who's going to flash each and every play. He's not, his dominant self. So you worry, is that just the injury and, that he's dealing with? Haven't seen that really big leap from his sophomore to junior season that you're really expecting him to. And this was the guy who waited until the very end to ultimately decide to enter the draft. He may have already decided that he was going to do it all along, but there still makes you wonder, maybe there was some pause there. I think this would be a nice pickup there for Seattle there at number 20. 21, Miami, we know that their pick was forfeited, so we move on to 22, and the Los Angeles Chargers. This is a team that is very frustrating to watch, to say the least. They should have beaten the Jacksonville Jaguars, ended up losing that game. And when you look at this team, I think another team that's going to need to address their line up front, that this is a team that porous against the run. I think edge rusher, getting another guy to help Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack out is going to be an area that they can focus on. I think they're going to need a nickel, especially if Bryce Callahan decides to leave. Keenan Allen could potentially be a cap casualty, though. And even if he is on the roster, you've got Michael Williams, and then obviously Josh Palmer. But there's not a whole lot of weapons there for Justin Herbert, from an explosive standpoint. And Jackson Smith and Jigba, this feels like the right place for him because he does remind you a lot of Keenan Allen. And I think if Keenan Allen does get released by the Chargers, then this pick almost has to be JSN. 6 foot, 197 pounds, really, battled that hamstring injury throughout the entire 2022 season. But if you watch his tape from 2021, 95 catches, over 1,600 yards, 9 touchdowns, just put on the film of that Utah game in the Rose Bowl, and, it was so much fun to watch. Most of his damage is going to be done in the slot. But look, when you're talking about a guy that had 15 catches, 347 yards, and 3 touchdowns in that game, averaged 23.1 yards per reception. And when you think about Ohio State on a receiving core that also had Chris Olave and the NFL's Offensive Rookie of the Year in Garrett Wilson, this guy still ended up with double-digit receptions in 4 of the last 5 games of the season. Over 240 yards against Nebraska, over 100 yards against Purdue, Michigan State, and Michigan, and then that Utah game, 347 yards. A guy that just got better and better down the stretch, and I think this guy, when healthy, could have been the number 1 receiver in this draft class. So I think the Chargers could potentially end up getting a steal there at number 22 overall. Baltimore. What's going to happen with Lamar Jackson? That's going to be the biggest question. He'll probably end up getting the franchise tag. I don't know that he ends up getting a long-term deal, especially battling the injuries. That's going to be a huge question mark. You've got Tyler Huntley right now as the backup. I do think, like I said, franchise tag is probably going to be what happens to Lamar Jackson when it's all said and done. You look at that cornerback position, you've got Marcus Peters and Kyle Fuller, who are free agents. So that's ultimately why I have Cam Smith, a playmaker, there at that cornerback position there out of South Carolina. But I'm also looking at Calais Campbell at that defensive end spot. Calais Campbell is a mammoth dude. He's 6'8", 307 pounds. He's 36 years of age. And when you look at that, you look at his age, it's one of those things to where, can he continue to compete at a high level at that defensive end position? He's a guy who's been a staple in the league a model of consistency, but he's a free agent at the end of the season. So really the big question mark is he still going to be around? That's going to be a huge question mark. Brent Urban is also a free agent there at the defensive end spot. That's why I think Lucas Van Ness would make a lot of sense here as well. I've got Cam Smith penciled in. I think Cam Smith is going to rise. I think Tampa ends up getting their corner that they desperately need. They can really send Jamel Dean on his way. And just a couple of picks later, Baltimore can end up getting an eventual replacement for Calais Campbell in Lucas Van Ness. Now, when I talk about Lucas Van Ness, I didn't really mention him too much. This is a guy, look, he didn't even start there for Iowa. So this is a guy that's continuing to develop. What you see is a guy who can overpower you. 6'5", 264 pounds, 19 tackles for loss, 13 sacks, including 6 this past season. So physical at the point of attack. This is a guy who was running over offensive tackles. Paris Johnson, he beat up. A guy who is he can be very physical. The bull rush is ridiculous, but the quickness coming off the ball as well. He is a little raw. So again, 19 might be a little too high. You get into the 20s, that might be the better range for him. I also wouldn't be surprised if Lucas Van Ness falls out of the first round altogether, but I think the traits, that's really what gets everyone excited. Minnesota's sitting there at 24. Minnesota's going to, has some question marks, I think. And when you look at Minnesota, obviously you have Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen. I think there's some issues, contract-wise there. But KJ Osborne, you could potentially look at some additional weapons. Potentially look at one of the receivers there in the draft. Garrett Bradbury's a free agent. Do you consider John Michael Schmitz in round 1? Probably not. Dalvin Tomlinson is a free agent. You look at the cornerback position, though. You've got Duke Shelley, Patrick Peterson, Chandon Sullivan, Chris Boyd, all free agents. So if the season were to start today, you're talking about Cam Dantzler and Caleb Evans as your starting corners. I think they're going to need to bring in a corner. The question is going to be whether or not they want to draft a corner or bring in a free agent, or potentially sign Patrick Peterson again. So I think this is another spot for Cam Smith. I think you also have to consider Emmanuel Forbes, Mississippi State, or Maryland's Deonte Banks. Physical corner there. A couple of guys with a tremendous length. They could end up being a first-round picks, or really fringe first-rounders that I have falling to day 2. But guys that could easily come off the board in round number 1. But really the thing that I think Minnesota has to ask themselves is, have they hit a plateau with Kirk Cousins? I know Kirk has won a lot of games for Minnesota. He's been a guy under center that's led them to the playoffs, but he hasn't been able to get them over the hump. That's really the big thing. Is he going to be their long-term answer there at that quarterback position? Kirk Cousins is just 34 years of age, and ultimately he's going to be a free agent at the end of this season, has the $35 million contract. The big question mark again is this going to be your quarterback that can get you to the Super Bowl? And obviously if you have those questions, then maybe he's not the guy. Maybe you need to start considering a potential replacement for him. If nothing else, I think this year, especially because it is a contract year, I'm looking at a guy like Anthony Richardson. Why not go after Anthony Richardson? Why not target him? This is a guy who is probably the most polarizing quarterback in this year's draft class because he has all the traits for days. He's the best athlete, period. 6'4", 235 pounds, cannon for an arm, rocket launcher for an arm. Can make all the throws. Doesn't matter. He looks like Patrick Mahomes with the way he was able to, whether he was rolling left, rolling right, moving forward, backpedaling, he was able to put the ball with velocity on the money. Big question mark with Anthony Richardson is he only has the 1 year as a starter, and he struggles mightily with the accuracy and being able to see the entire field. So he's a bit of a project. And 53.8% completion percentage in his 12 starts there for Florida. 2,549 yards, 17 touchdowns. Did have the 9 picks as well. But again, he's so fast as a runner. 654 yards on the ground, 9 touchdowns. A guy that is a threat to go really the distance on any given play because he has that speed and the long strides for being a guy, who's also so tall. So when you have a guy who has all of those traits and he's just oozing potential, you bring him in, he can learn from Kirk Cousins, could also motivate Kirk Cousins, and ultimately if Kirk Cousins brings you to the exact same spot as he did this past season and where he's continuing to bring your franchise, at some point you have to wonder, is this the best that we can do with Kirk Cousins under center? At some point you have to find a guy, this is a polarizing prospect. He's not for everyone. But if you do hit with Anthony Richardson, you've got a guy who, you're looking for, the next Patrick Mahomes, the next Josh Allen. This could be the guy. You just have to be able to develop him. And that's going to be that huge question mark. But when you have a head coach like Kevin O'Connell, an offensive mind, there is that possibility. I wouldn't rule it out. That's why I've got him penciled in there to the Vikings. And, depending on what happens at that cornerback position, that's the only other position that I can really see them targeting in round one. I think they may end up pulling the trigger and going quarterback here. Jacksonville sitting there at number 25 overall. And I think the Jaguars can go in a couple of different directions with this pick. This is obviously an ascending franchise. You love what Doug Peterson's been able to do with them. All the defensive starters are going to be back, which means you really shift to the offensive side of the football. Could they go receiver? You've got Marvin Jones, who's a free agent. You've got Christian Kirk, Zay Jones. Not a whole lot of weapons after that. So I think that could potentially be a target. Look for potentially a guy like Jalen Hyatt. If Jackson Smith-Njigba or Quentin Johnston were to fall, that could potentially be a target here as well. Josh Downs, Zay Flowers are also receivers that could potentially be in the mix. Even Kayshon Boutte. Look, it was just a couple of years ago that Jacksonville went with a DJ Chark out of LSU. Get another LSU Tiger potentially there in Boutte. That could potentially be an option. But I really think that if Jacksonville, they could go corner. Tyson Campbell they brought in from a year ago. You've got Shaquille Griffin, Darius Williams on the roster. There's Chris Claybrooks, who's gotten a little bit of playing time. So they could go corner. And again, I mentioned the names, the same names will apply here for Jacksonville. But I'm looking at that offensive line. And, you've got Ben Barch and Brandon Sheriff there at the guard position. Could potentially still be a spot where you could drop Osiris Torrance because Luke Fortner is going to be your guy there at the center spot. Walker Little has played there well there at left tackle in Cam Robinson's absence, but Jawan Taylor is a free agent there at that right tackle position. And so you're talking about potentially getting a right tackle in there to take over for Jawan Taylor. Could Walker Little play that right tackle spot and ultimately give you the bookends with Robinson and Little protecting Trevor Lawrence? I mean, that's a question that we're going to have to see kind of play out there with Jacksonville. If the answer is yes, then you're looking at that tight end position. That's the other spot that the Jacksonville Jaguars could look at because you've got Evan Ingram, Chris Manhertz, Dan Arnold, all free agents. What's going to happen there at tight end? If those guys are gone, then I think you're looking at either Dalton Kincaid out of Utah, the pass catcher, or you go Darnell Washington out of Georgia. Darnell Washington would be more of your Mercedes Lewis type, the big physical guy, tremendous blocker, but also a physical mismatch. Dalton Kincaid, just put on the first game there against USC, double-digit receptions, over 200 yards, leading the Utes to the victory over the Trojans. Either one of those guys I think would be a great pick there for Jacksonville. Gives you another weapon for Trevor Lawrence in the passing game. Darnell Washington may actually be the better fit because he's the better blocker, can help in that running game with Travis Etienne, but I've got them taking Anton Harrison at least for now. I think you've got to figure out that right tackle position, and if Cam Robinson is going to stay on the roster, you're keeping him around. They may end up deciding to let Cam Robinson go, and Walker Little becomes their left tackle. You still have to figure out what you're doing with Jawan Taylor. Anton Harrison, big 6'7", 310-pounder, would make a lot of sense. You bring him in there. Little and Harrison being your bookends could be blocking for Trevor Lawrence for a long time. Giants sitting there at 26. Giants, they're in an interesting situation. You've got Danny Dimes there at the quarterback spot, and Brian Daboll really resurrected his career. And you've got Saquon Barkley. Both of those guys are free agents. And will they be able to re-sign both of them? I think that's the goal. They want to bring both of those guys back. If Saquon's gone, then I think maybe the Giants try to make a play for Bijan, possibly even look at Jahmyr Gibbs. But when you look at the receiver position, I think this ultimately is where they go. You've got Kenny Golladay, you've got Isaiah Hodgins on the roster, Wan'Dale Robinson was brought in as well, but Sterling Shepard, Darius Slayton, Marcus Johnson, Richie James, all free agents. So you have to look receiver at some point. If you go in round one, Jalen Hyatt out of Tennessee. Now, to me, obviously the limited route tree there with Tennessee, they ran those wide splits, and this was a guy who was really running a lot of go routes, maybe run a post or two, but really everything was down the field. And I think there's limitations to his game, but he's going to run a sub 4.4. Everyone's going to be blown away by it. And I give flashbacks to Corey Coleman and Will Fuller. Speed kills. Those guys were drafted much higher than they probably should have. And I think that there's going to be a team that's going to fall in love with the speed of Jalen Hyatt. Brian Daboll may be too smart for that. I think Jalen Hyatt needs to develop a little bit more. I think he's a guy that probably should be a round 2 pick, even though he was a Blitnikoff Award winner this year, and the 6 touchdown game under his belt, and there's a lot of explosiveness, but some of that could have been the product of Josh Heupel's offense. I still think that speed, you put him in there in that offense, especially with Saquon. You've got Danny Dimes being able to throw that ball deep. Maybe that's what Brian Daboll is looking for at the end of the day. I've got Hyatt penciled in there. I think Hyatt's going to end up being a first-round pick because someone is going to fall in love with that speed. It happens every year. Coleman and Fuller are guys that are coming off the board in the mid-first round. Then I think Jalen Hyatt's going to be another guy that we're going to see come off the board in round number 1 as well. Now Dallas sitting at 27. This is a team that's going to be really interesting. Could they make a play for Bijan Robinson, especially with Tony Pollard as a free agent, and the long term, what's happening with Zeke Elliott? Long term, is he going to be the answer there, because he's kind of faded, and as Tony Pollard's role has continued to expand, they can't really rely on Ezekiel Elliott as they used to. So that's going to be a big question mark. What's going to happen with him? Running back could end up rising to the top of their needs. Dalton Schultz is a free agent. You look at Jake Ferguson, Peyton Hendershot, Sean McCown, Ian Bunting are their backup tight ends. They need a number 1 pass catcher. Dalton Kincaid would be a great pick here. You look at the receiver spot. You've got Noah Brown, T.Y. Hilton as free agents. You got CeeDee Lamb and Michael Gallup. You're going to need that third wideout to fill in that spot if Brown isn't going to be there. So again, Jackson Smith and Jigba. You look at Josh Downs or potentially Zay Flowers. You could also decide to pick up one of the top receivers in round number 2 or round 3. I think ultimately the focus shifts to the defensive side of the football. And when I look at this, I see that linebacking core is screaming at me. You've got Leighton Vander Esch, who's going to be a free agent. Damone Clark, Jabril Cox backing him up. Do they really feel that either of those guys could fill in for Vander Esch? Then you have Anthony Barr, Luke Gifford at the weak side backer, who are also free agents. Micah Parsons isn't going to be able to do it all himself. I think ultimately this pick, because some people are picking corner, and look, Dallas could decide to go with maybe Cam Smith opposite Trevon Diggs to get bookends there on the back end of the defense. Now that Anthony Brown is a free agent, but I'm looking at Drew Sanders out of Arkansas. And I see him as a potential replacement for Leighton Vander Esch. Look, a guy who he's had those question marks with the injuries with his neck. Drew Sanders transferred from Alabama to the Hogs. 6'5", 230 pounds, and we really got to see what this kid could do. Over 100 tackles, 103 to be exact, 13.5 going for loss, 9.5 sacks, had 5 pass breakups, 3 forced fumbles, and an interception. So this guy's got a nose for the football, a guy that can make plays behind the line of scrimmage, has sideline to sideline ability, can play against the run and the pass. And so I think that versatility really would bode well for Dallas. And a guy that I think can fly around and make plays behind, that defensive front, and really Micah Parsons wherever he lines up. I think this will be a great addition to Dallas overall in that defense. Buffalo sitting there at 28, and look, this is a team that you're just waiting for them to get over the hump, right? That's going to be the big question: is when is that going to happen? And I look at Buffalo. I think running back, depending on what happens with Devin Singletary, running back could potentially be an area that they focus on. So I think Jahmyr Gibbs could potentially be in play. You look at Roger Saffold, Ike Bacher and Bobby Hart at guard. Ryan Bates is back there at right guard. But who's going to play that left guard position? You could potentially see Osiris Torrance make his way into the first round if he's not already off the board, like I have him going to Pittsburgh. Linebacker, AJ Klein, Tremaine Edmonds, both free agents. You're going to need another linebacker to play there with Matt Milano. So I think both Drew Sanders and Trenton Simpson are going to be in play here. But really, I'm looking at that safety position. You've got Jordan Poyer, who's a free agent. You've got Dean Marlowe, a free agent. Jaquan Johnson, a free agent. Micah Hyde is on there. And if Poyer is not re-signed, they're going to have to address that safety spot. I look at that secondary, and you've got Dane Jackson. You just brought in Khair Elam. There's Taron Johnson. The versatility of Brian Branch there at Alabama, a guy who can cover, he can play safety, he can play in the box if you need him to. He's kind of that Swiss Army knife. Where do you want to line him up? He can do a little bit of everything. I just look at that defense, and this could be one of those chess pieces that they can really just see what Leslie Frazier can have a lot of fun with Brian Branch, deciding where they want him to play. Again, this free agency is going to ultimately dictate a lot with what Buffalo decides to do. But I think Brian Branch will be a lot of fun for Leslie Frazier on the back end of that defense. Cincy, 29 overall. We know that that's their pick. You've got Dalton Kincaid, the tight end out of Utah. That's ultimately who I have coming off the board to the Bengals. And when I look at their team, you've got Hayden Hurst, who is a free agent. And, look, he played well, especially in the playoffs for the Bengals. Mitchell Wilcox, Devin Asiasi are on the roster there, but they need a guy who's really going to be a playmaker at that tight end position. And without Hayden Hurst, Dalton Kincaid makes a lot of sense. You've got Joe Mixon on the roster at that running back position. And here's the concern with Joe Mixon. I think his production in 2022, you saw a little bit of a regression out of him. So what's going to happen there with Joe? Is he a guy that could potentially be a cap casualty? Could we be surprised and see him let go? He's a free agent after the 2024 season. I don't see him going anywhere, but just something to think about. You already have Samaje Perine and Travion Henderson as free agents. If the Bengals do decide to move on from Joe Mixon, and again, I don't think they do, but Jahmyr Gibbs could potentially be an option there. I figured I'd at least bring it up. There are a lot of people that are starting to talk about Joe Mixon and that decline. They need to make sure they're staying ahead of the curve there. So that could be an option. That offensive line, is always a question. Joe Burrow seems to get beaten up a lot. Jonah Williams is another guy whose long-term health has to be in question. Although Jackson Carman played well in his stead, you got Cordell Volson, Ted Karras, Alex Kappa, Lyle Collins there up front. Hakeem Adeniji had to fill in for Lyle Collins. Max Sharping, who's a free agent, filled in for Alex Kappa. A lot of injuries across that line. A lot of young guys on that line as well. So I don't know that necessarily bringing in another rookie offensive lineman makes a lot of sense. I think keep an eye on that safety spot because both Jesse Bates and Von Bell are free agents. You do have Dax Hill there, but either Antonio Johnson or Brian Branch would make a lot of sense here. You also have Eli Apple and Trey Flowers as free agents. Cam Taylor-Britt has made a strong play to be that starting corner opposite Chidobe Awuzie. So it'll be interesting to see where Cincy goes. Could they go corner? Could they potentially even address that middle linebacker spot if Jermaine Pratt leaves in free agency? I think that's another potential position. So when you think about Drew Sanders, he could be that guy there as well. I just think that Dalton Kincaid, as of right now, makes the most sense for the Bengals there at 29. Number 30, the Saints get back into round number 1. This was a pick that Denver got from San Francisco, and then the Saints were able to go ahead and get that from Denver. And when you look at the Saints, and ultimately you're talking about this pick, they ended up getting it in the whole Sean Payton hiring there for the Broncos. And I think defensive line is definitely an area that I could see the Saints targeting. I think they could also target a receiver. David Onyemata, Shai Suttle, Kentavious Street, all free agents. Michael Thomas, Jarvis Landry, also free agents there. They don't really have a tight end of note. And looking at this draft class, Darnell Washington would be a nice pickup here. You also have Mark Ingram and David Johnson, the running backs behind Alvin Kamara. Could you go Jahmyr Gibbs in round 1? I think you could, but I think you could get guys in on day 2, a guy like Zach Charbonnet, potentially Sean Tucker later on in the draft. Be able to get some guys in there that can complement Alvin Kamara. I think Jahmyr Gibbs is a lot like Alvin Kamara, so do you really want to bring in a clone of your running back in to be his backup? That'd be a big question mark there for me. I don't know that necessarily makes a lot of sense, but I do think receiver is a definite target area. You've got Chris Olave, who's going to be running the show with him. Marcus Callaway has played well, but I think Rashid Shaheed has gotten some playing time. But I really think that they need to think about getting some additional weapons for Jameis Winston, Andy Dalton, Derek Carr, whoever's going to be the quarterback there. Get some weapons. Ultimately, free agency is going to dictate what's going to happen there. You look at that tight end position, Juwan Johnson, Adam Troutman, and Taysom Hill. Okay, but if you can get a guy like Darnell Washington in there, he's the best blocker of that group. Juwan Johnson is a converted wide receiver. Adam Troutman's more of a receiving tight end. Taysom Hill is a converted quarterback. I think you get a guy like Darnell Washington in there to block for Alvin Kamara. That's really another offensive lineman, 6'7", 270 pounds. He's a sixth offensive lineman out there essentially. So he would make a lot of sense for the Saints there at 30. 31 and 32, is it going to be the Chiefs or the Eagles? Right now I've got it penciled in Eagles as the favorite, so Kansas City Chiefs there at 31 overall. I've got them taking an offensive tackle, and I think it's easy to really look at that line and see why. Andrew Wiley there at right tackle. I don't think that he's going to be the answer. He's a free agent. Darnell Wright was the best right tackle, probably the best tackle overall at the Senior Bowl, and really looked good on the right side there. This is a guy, if you watch the pull trap technique, he does that better than anybody. A guy who moves really well. You watch the tape against Will Anderson, did a really good job there against Will Anderson. This is a guy who could be an ascending prospect and continue to move up draft boards. I think KC, this would be a perfect fit for him there at that right tackle spot for Patrick Mahomes. And then finally at 32 overall, I think the Eagles, this could be a defensive tackle. Kalijah Kancey, potentially. This could potentially be a running back in Jahmyr Gibbs. I ultimately went with Keon White out of Georgia Tech, the pass rusher. This is a guy who I think has continued to get better and better. the more we've seen him play. I think the play that everyone wants to turn to was his ability to turn and run with the running back down the sideline. At 6'4" and 267 pounds, 14 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks, and 19 tackles for loss in 2019 at Old Dominion. Then transferred to Georgia Tech and played his last 2 years there with the Ramblin' Wreck. But ultimately, this is the guy who I think is continuing to get better. He's still a bit on the raw side, but I think about a line, the edge rushers that eventually would be Josh Sweat and Keon White with obviously Hassan Reddick there at that linebacker position. That could be a formidable group for the Eagles. And if you're the Eagles, then you could think about on day 2 targeting guys. Like if I look at who I have for them, I have them ultimately taking a defensive tackle there in round number 2. Have them taking Carl Brooks out of Bowling Green, a guy who could have been a potential edge rusher. He was really a 5 technique, a guy that I thought could end up being an end, but he shows up at the Senior Bowl at 300 pounds. He still showcases the quickness coming off the football, and a guy that can get after the quarterback. That was one of the things that really stood out when you watched him play there at Bowling Green. At 6'4", 280 pounds, had 46 tackles for loss, 27.5 sacks, including 10 this past season, and a guy who lined up everywhere with his hand in the dirt. He was a stand-up. They really played him all over that line, and he was really a lot of fun to watch. And then when you talk about the Eagles, day 2 later on, in round number 3, you can get a running back like Chase Brown out of Illinois. There in round number 3, Roshan Johnson would be another potential guy. Even Tyjae Spears out of Tulane, or Tank Bigsby out of Auburn. They're all sitting there in that 3rd round range. So I don't think Philly needs to get greedy or get antsy and go after a running back early. You can wait until day 2, shore up the defense early. A defense that's likely going to get rated in free agency, and then look to that running back position after that. But again, things could change depending on what moves the Eagles decide to make in free agency. They might be able to bring some of the players back, be able to shuffle some of those priorities a little bit. So that's the first mock draft 1.0 of my first round. If you want to take a look at all 7 rounds of my initial mock draft, go to readyforthedraft.com. Make sure you click on the 2023 NFL Draft up at the top. It'll take you to my top 10 rankings, but then there's also the drop down. You'll be able to select each of those rounds, really take a look at each of the picks, and as we progress, that site will actually have a full breakdown for the first round, be able to really outline all of my thoughts as we start moving closer to the draft itself, and add some more commentary with my thoughts on each of the picks as we go throughout the season. But the next podcast, we're really going to start getting ready for the combine. That'll be the next conversation that I think we're going to need to have. Is talking about that. We have some time. February 28th is really the start of that combine through March 6th. So we'll be gearing up for that. We'll really get to have that conversation. Maybe we'll look at offense and defense, split it up into 2 podcasts, make it a little bit shorter. I know this podcast ran a little long, but maybe that's what we'll do. We'll space it out. Offense, defense, really talk about the combine, and then once we do have the combine, we'll be able to talk about the results, what it really told us, who are the guys that made a lot of money, and who has some ground that they need to make up. So for readyforthedraft.com, this has been the Ready for the Draft podcast. I've been your host, Gregg Schutze. Take care, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. Enjoy the Super Bowl.